Hello there. Thanks for swinging by the channel today and tuning in. Today, one of the things that we're going to talk about is something that comes up fairly regularly when we're thinking about generally relationships, but we're going to talk a little bit about narcissism today. We'll provide a little bit of education about it, what to do, how to spot it, and then what to do if you find that you are in a relationship or you might be the one who is the narcissist in the relationship. We wanted to do some of this because this is one of those topics that oftentimes feels as though it's going around social media quite regularly. And we wanted to talk about how often this actually happens and provide a little bit of insight to it. Keep in mind that this is the clinical terms for narcissism, which is probably different than a culturally accepted use of the word narcissism. So the question is what is narcissism, or what is a narcissist, and what do they look like? Narcissism, at least the clinical definition, is derived from the history of a Greek god in mythology who was obsessed with himself and spent a good chunk of his time staring at his own reflection in a pool until the point of actually dying. And so narcissism has kind of become this word that we've used for focusing on oneself. Now, the important piece here is that the mythological narcissist was focused on his physical appearance. That's not necessarily the case in the clinical terms, although that's not the case either. Narcissism is something that is categorized by a few different things that we're going to talk about today. Let's talk for a moment about how prevalent narcissism actually is. I feel like some things that I hear regularly in therapy or I will see through social media is that somebody's partner or their significant other or a boss is very narcissistic. I myself have been told that I'm narcissistic, which is totally debatable. I don't think that I fall on this scale, and maybe after talking about this, you'll know why. So narcissism is very hard to measure, but some of the best guesses indicate that somewhere between 0.5 or 0.5% to about 5% of the population in the United States might struggle with narcissism to the degree of a personality disorder. What this indicates is that as frequently as we see this, as frequently as we hear this, or as frequently as we type this into a Google search bar, less than 5% of the population, as based on best estimates, less than 5% of the population actually meet criteria for narcissism. But let's talk about some of those criteria. The first criteria is that there is usually an inflated sense of grandiosity regarding yourself. Again, this doesn't have to be specifically a physical appearance, but an increased level of importance. This might look something like, if we took a work environment example, if I were not here today, work would fall apart. The company would discontinue functioning. It's important to note that this is different from an anxiety perspective, where I myself have known myself or others to experience a level of anxiety that if working for a company, I get sick and I can't come in, then the whole day is ruined, right? Narcissism is the opposite. It's, I am worth so much that this company wouldn't thrive, or survive is maybe a better word, without me. So narcissism can be a very inflated sense of grandiosity regarding the self. Another criteria for narcissism is a need or a sense of need for admiration from others. Now, it's important, again, less than 5% of the population struggle with the need from admiration based on narcissism, but it might be more so accepted with anxiety. An example of this would be, it always feels good to receive a compliment, whether it's a compliment from your spouse or your children, coworkers, friends and family. Wanting a compliment or hoping to hear about some of your strengths doesn't make you narcissistic. Doing things in your life specifically with the intent to hear how great you are is. And when you don't get that, a narcissist may often become critical of the person who did not give them the compliment that they were looking for. So keep in mind that narcissism really is a very high level of self-interest and self-focused, where if their needs are not being met, they will oftentimes become critical of the people in their lives. Another characteristic of narcissism, which is also a hallmark and very important, is an inability to experience empathy for others. This can be very difficult to measure as well. I feel like oftentimes I hear in therapy that a spouse just doesn't understand, or they don't recognize how important it is to me. This isn't necessarily a sign of a lack of empathy, but a lack of empathy would look something more like when you might be struggling emotionally, whether it's anxiety or stress from work or from kids. Maybe you're feeling depressed or embarrassed about a situation, and you are having an emotional response. The lack of empathy might look something like an inability to provide comfort. I think it's a natural human urge to want to give someone a hug and provide a little bit of comfort. In this situation, the lack of empathy may look like a lack of understanding or a lack of care that you're struggling, and maybe there's not that urge to provide comfort when feeling distressed. Another criteria is a sense of entitlement. Oftentimes, folks with the clinical version of narcissism feel as though they are entitled to certain things. This might be special or preferential treatment in social events. They shouldn't have to stand in line. They shouldn't have to pay specific fees. They're entitled to certain things that is different than what just the commonplace individual is. I think that's a pretty hallmark sign of narcissism. Perhaps the most disturbing of all of the clinical terms for narcissism, or the clinical definitions, is that narcissism oftentimes doesn't have difficulty exploiting others. When somebody with narcissism doesn't have difficulty exploiting others, I think this is something that's very difficult for many of us to understand. And I think that's in part because most of us can't fathom the idea of utilizing somebody else for personal gain. Now, this is different. Oftentimes throughout my life, as I've changed careers or moved around to different jobs, as I've gone through school or whatever, there's a statement that said that it's all about who you know and not about what you know. This is a fairly common thing. Sometimes jobs are acquired because of who you know, opportunities that are given. That's certainly been my experience. The idea of utilizing somebody and exploiting them for my own personal gain seems very strange to me, and I imagine that it does to others. However, this is in fact exactly what happens. It's not who I know to give me an opportunity for employment. It's who I know that I might be willing to throw them under the bus for the promotion at the job and not feel guilty about it. Again, there's that lack of empathy. It might be I'm going to have a specific friend, not because I want to be a friend with that person, but because they might have an in to a social crowd I want to be a part of, and then have no problem throwing that person under the bus and exploiting them so that I can get into a different social circle. I think this is probably one of the challenges with recognizing whether or not we're in a narcissistic relationship, because it becomes very difficult for us to fathom that somebody may purposefully be exploiting us because it's not something that we ourselves would do. Anyways, this is a couple of the ideas and definitions behind the clinical term of narcissism. I appreciate you guys swinging by this channel. In upcoming videos, we're going to discuss this more in depth, but as you follow our channel and as you have more interest in the idea of narcissism, keep in mind that these are some of the criteria for a narcissism or a narcissistic person: a lack or inability to experience empathy, entitlement, willing to exploit others, and an inflated sense of self-importance or grandiosity. Thanks for swinging by. I appreciate that, and I hope that this definition has helped a little bit. Tune into some of our other videos to provide more context on what this might look like. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.